Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. August 2nd, 2018, Elizabeth City, North Carolina. A summer evening that should have passed quietly instead ended in tragedy. Within minutes of a frantic 911 call, deputies entered a modest home on a quiet street and discovered 55-year-old antiques dealer Milton Sawyer unresponsive. What at first sounded like a burglary gone wrong would, later that night and in the days ahead, reveal a crime born inside the very house it pretended to imitate. Milton Sawyer was known throughout Elizabeth City as a steady presence. His antique store had become a familiar stop for collectors and neighbors alike. He was dependable, approachable, and rarely involved in conflict. In a town where people still left doors unlocked, Milton represented stability. That stability was broken the moment law enforcement stepped into his home. The initial account relayed by his wife was dramatic. Masked men had forced their way in, assaulted her, and attacked her husband. To first responders, that description demanded urgency. Within minutes, deputies cleared the perimeter, marked points of entry, and called emergency medical services. Yet the moment the rooms were secured, subtle details contradicted the story. The locks were intact. Windows were undamaged. Valuable items, jewelry, electronics, cash, remained untouched. The staging felt forced, a scene arranged to tell a story that the evidence did not support. For investigators, this was the first quiet anomaly. In a real burglary, chaos leaves its mark: forced locks, scattered belongings, missing property. Here, what they found instead was order where disorder should have been, and disorder where it made no sense. It was a crime scene presenting itself as a burglary, but one that did not fit the known patterns. Milton's body showed signs that did not align with the tale of an armed intruder. The preliminary examination noted injuries consistent with strangulation, not a gunshot or blunt assault. His wife had a small cut near her temple, consistent with a superficial blow, but not with the force of the attack she described. Deputies recorded her account, but quietly noted the contradictions. One investigator later remarked, "The data aligned too cleanly." Sometimes that was the problem. Elizabeth City deputies understood the pressure. In small communities, crime of this magnitude shocks the system. The sheriff's office immediately called in state investigators to ensure proper forensic processing. Evidence technicians documented the entire scene with photographs, logged each room, and bagged trace items for later analysis. They took possession of phones, computers, and handwritten notes from inside the residence. They worked through the night, knowing that the first hours after discovery are critical. The timeline was locked down. The neighbor's 911 call logged just after 10 o'clock at night. Deputies on scene within minutes. EMS confirming Milton's death shortly thereafter. Angel Sawyer's initial statement was carefully transcribed, her timeline compared against dispatch logs. The data points did not move, but the story wrapped around them was already beginning to fray. Investigators now faced two parallel tasks. 1. Confirm whether an intruder could have entered unseen and escaped in minutes. 2. Test the victimology of Milton Sawyer. Did he have enemies, debts, disputes, or hidden conflicts that could explain a targeted killing? Neither path offered easy answers that night, but both would need to be pursued. In small towns, rumors spread faster than official statements. By the following morning, whispers about the antiques dealer's death reached the community. Some repeated the story of a violent break-in. Others questioned why nothing had been stolen. The sheriff's office kept its statements narrow. A death investigation, evidence being processed, no suspects named. Behind closed doors, detectives reviewed the first wave of evidence. The absence of forced entry was more than just a missing detail. It was a negative indicator that spoke loudly. Digital forensics began the next morning, with technicians pulling call records and checking the victim's phone activity. The results would be critical in the days ahead. The importance of these early hours cannot be overstated. Law enforcement knows that the first version of events offered by witnesses is often the least reliable. Memories are clouded by stress and sometimes by design. What stood out here was how the supposed intruders left almost no trace of their presence. Milton's friends and customers were stunned. They described him as kind, reliable, a man who dedicated his life to his business and community. There was no record of violence, no known disputes. Detectives asked a simple but central question. If this was really a burglary, why was Milton killed? And why was nothing taken? And if it wasn't a burglary, then what kind of crime were they truly looking at? By the end of the first 24 hours, investigators had more questions than answers. The house was sealed as a crime scene. Autopsy scheduling was underway. Digital evidence was queued for review. The spouse was released after questioning, her statement logged, her injuries photographed. From the outside, it still looked like a burglary. Inside the case file, however, doubts were already circling in red ink. The night deputies entered Milton Sawyer's house, the first impression was confusion. To any trained officer, a burglary has a certain rhythm. Forced doors, splintered frames, ransacked rooms, valuables missing. Here, what they encountered was a home that looked disturbed only in patches. Certain items were out of place, furniture shifted, drawers opened, but valuables remained, untouched in plain sight. It was a puzzle that did not fit the pattern of a break-in. Forensics technicians moved slowly and methodically through each room. They marked points of possible disturbance, photographed every angle, and created a log of objects that looked tampered with. In the living room, a chair was pushed sideways, but the dust around its legs showed no drag marks. In the kitchen, a drawer was pulled open, but utensils inside were orderly. These inconsistencies matter. Staged crime scenes often contain signals, small mismatches between the story and the physical record. Here, investigators saw them everywhere. The bedroom where Milton was found showed clearer contradictions. Personal items were stacked neatly on a dresser, undisturbed. His wallet with cash inside sat visible. Electronics remained plugged in, cords neatly arranged. A genuine intruder motivated by theft would rarely leave behind such opportunities. Yet the pattern held: surface-level disorder, deeper-level order. For seasoned detectives, this was not the chaos of a burglary, but the choreography of a staged narrative. The spouse's account, given in the early hours of questioning, suggested masked men burst in, subdued her, and attacked Milton. Forensics had to test every element of that claim. Entry points were dusted for prints and inspected for tool marks. None appeared. Doors and windows showed no pry damage. Locks were intact. Even the door frame paint was unbroken. These negative findings carried weight. In law enforcement procedure, absence of evidence is not just silence. It can directly contradict a claim. Technicians also noted Angel Sawyer's superficial injuries. She bore a small cut on her temple and minor bruising. Medical staff later categorized these as consistent with a shallow blow, not the kind of repeated force an armed intruder would deliver. Investigators documented this carefully. They knew in future court proceedings, these photographs and medical notes would be compared line by line against the initial 911 narrative. The most significant discovery that night came from the medical examiner's preliminary findings. Milton's injuries were consistent with strangulation. His body showed no evidence of gunshot wounds, stab wounds, or blunt force trauma from a heavy weapon. For a story that began with an armed invasion, this detail cut against the grain. It suggested not a chaotic assault by strangers, but a deliberate method of killing. The finding was logged as preliminary pending autopsy, but already it shifted the focus of investigators. In cases like this, detectives are trained to ask, does the scene support the witness, or does it contradict them? The Sawyer residence leaned heavily toward contradiction. It gave back more questions than answers. Why stage a burglary? Why leave everything valuable in place? Why choose strangulation as the method of death? Each question pulled the narrative further from the account of masked intruders and closer toward the possibility of an inside act. Processing the scene required discipline. Crime scene investigators bagged items in order, documented chain of custody, and transported evidence for analysis. They seized phones, computers, and documents to be examined later by digital forensics teams. They cataloged fingerprints from surfaces likely touched, although no unidentified foreign prints were recovered that night. This negative evidence would later prove crucial. If intruders had been inside, some trace of their presence should have remained. In towns like Elizabeth City, a crime scene like this resonates beyond the house. Neighbors watch from behind blinds. They know law enforcement is piecing together something that will eventually ripple across the community. Detectives are aware of this too, but they keep focus on procedure. Each inconsistency becomes a breadcrumb in the chain toward the truth. The room as seen analysis became the foundation for the case. It marked the first pivot point where investigators saw a staged story instead of a stranger's attack. The contradictions between narrative and evidence had to be reconciled. And when stories evolve faster than the evidence, investigators slow everything down. They return to the data, the physical record, and the procedural facts that cannot be argued away. When the physical scene failed to support the story of masked intruders, investigators turned to the next line of inquiry, the data. In modern investigations, phone records, digital messaging, and financial activity often speak more reliably than human witnesses. In Milton Sawyer's case, these sources became the backbone for testing the narrative. Detectives submitted requests for call detail records from the night of August 2, 2018, and the days leading up to it. They wanted to know not only who Milton had been in contact with, but also whether his wife's timeline matched the digital evidence. Call logs were mapped against tower sectors around Elizabeth City. This was not GPS pinpointing, but cell site data, enough to establish whether a phone was in the area of the residence or away at critical windows of time. The results were immediate and significant. Milton's phone activity stopped abruptly on the evening of August 2nd. No calls, no messages, no app use after the time deputies estimated his death. That silence aligned with the medical examiner's preliminary conclusion of strangulation. By contrast, his wife's phone remained active. She exchanged multiple messages that evening, including with one particular contact who appeared far more frequently than others in her logs. For investigators, this discrepancy was an early red flag. Financial data added another layer. Milton's account showed routine patterns, payments connected to his antiques business, modest purchases, nothing irregular. But the joint household accounts told a different story. Detectives noticed withdrawals and transfers that did not match Milton's spending habits. Some were connected to accounts associated with the same person who appeared frequently in his wife's phone records. Investigators began charting a parallel track, digital contact and financial links leading to the same external figure. The investigative team also reviewed phone activity on the night of the 911 call. While Milton's device had gone silent, his wife's device showed outgoing communication before she ran to the neighbor's house. That sequence mattered. If an intruder had suddenly entered and attacked, the window for such communication would have been severely limited. The phone logs did not support that compressed timeline. Interviews were revisited with this new information in hand. Detectives compared statements given by Angel Sawyer against the call detail records. Where she claimed to be with her husband at certain times, her phone indicated she was engaged in lengthy conversations with another individual. These contradictions did not prove guilt outright, but they dismantled the credibility of her initial account. In forensic terms, the testimonial record was now marked as unreliable. At the same time, investigators looked for corroboration from outside parties. They identified the individual who appeared most often in Angel's phone records, a licensed massage therapist named Isaac Melcher. His number was found in multiple days of calls and texts, some extending late into the night. The sheer volume suggested more than casual acquaintance. Detectives prepared to bring him in for questioning, but before that, they sought to strengthen their case with more concrete links. Digital forensics teams examined message content. Portions of the text history showed coded exchanges that suggested planning or secrecy. Combined with the financial transfers, the data pointed toward coordination rather than coincidence. Law enforcement knew they would need to validate these findings in court, so every record was preserved with proper chain of custody. The integrity of the evidence would later withstand defense challenges only because it was carefully documented at this stage. From a procedural standpoint, this was the moment the investigation pivoted fully from unknown intruders to known associates. The absence of forced entry had already suggested someone familiar with the home. Now the phone records and financial activity supported that direction. Each new data point pulled investigators closer to identifying not just opportunity, but motive. In towns like Elizabeth City, crimes like this test more than investigative skill. They test community trust. People wanted to believe the initial story of masked strangers because it distanced the violence from their own circle. But as detectives pieced together the evidence, it became clear that the crime originated not from outside threat, but from inside betrayal. The investigation team understood the sensitivity of moving forward. To accuse a spouse is always serious, and to connect a third party requires airtight evidence. Digital and financial records were that evidence. They did not rely on memory or interpretation. They showed time-stamped facts that contradicted the story told to deputies within minutes of Milton's death. By the end of this phase of the investigation, the evidence board at the sheriff's office had changed. The burglary theory was no longer viable. The path forward involved identifying how the relationship between Angel Sawyer and Isaac Melcher connected directly to Milton's death. The next step would be confronting both individuals with the evidence and documenting their responses under formal questioning. Milton Sawyer's life had to be examined before the investigation could move forward. Detectives understood that victimology often clarifies motive, opportunity, and risk. Who Milton was, how he lived, and what pressures surrounded him. All of that would either support the theory of a random attack or dismantle it. Milton, age 55, owned and operated Sawyer's House of Furniture and Antiques in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. He was known locally as a man of steady routine. He opened his shop early, handled customer deliveries personally, and closed around the same hour each evening. Friends described him as loyal, methodical, and rooted in the community. His store had long-standing customers, and while antiques are not the most lucrative trade, Milton was steady in his earnings and consistent with his business obligations. Investigators built a profile, a small business owner with predictable movements, well-liked, and not known for high-risk behavior. No significant debt, no criminal history, and no involvement in disputes that neighbors could recall. In other words, Milton was not an easy target for random street crime. The autopsy confirmed death by strangulation, ruling out a medical event or accident. Strangulation requires time, intent, and direct contact. That meant the perpetrator had to be close and committed. The medical examiner noted no defensive wounds consistent with a struggle against multiple armed intruders. Instead, the findings pointed to a focused assault. That clinical report further weakened the theory of a sudden burglary by strangers. Investigators next examined what might be called Milton's escalation risk. Had there been threats, disputes, or lifestyle changes that could attract outside violence? They found none. Milton was not involved in gambling, narcotics, or criminal networks. He did not report stalkers, nor had he filed complaints about harassment. The risk assessment returned neutral. If there was escalation, it was not from outside the household. It had to be closer. Attention returned to the domestic environment. Interviews with neighbors and friends revealed a marriage that, while publicly functional, carried quiet tension. Some neighbors mentioned arguments, others noticed distance between Milton and his wife. While none of these observations were conclusive, they placed the investigation squarely back inside the home. Detectives compiled a social network analysis. They looked at Milton's known associates, his daily contacts, and his financial links. Nothing suggested enemies or opportunistic criminals circling him. Yet the growing discrepancy between his stable lifestyle and the violent nature of his death forced investigators to question the household narrative. If Milton was not a man living on the edge, then his victimology underscored that the crime did not come from outside randomness. It came from intimate betrayal. The escalation in this case was not visible to Milton's friends, but digital records revealed an undercurrent. His wife's consistent contact with Isaac Melcher, the massage therapist, suggested a hidden relationship. Combined with the financial transfers and the absence of burglary evidence, this pointed toward planning, not spontaneous crime. Investigators weighed how much of this victimology to share with the community. Public reassurance matters in small towns. If residents were told it was a targeted act tied to personal relationships, community fear of random violence could ease. But releasing too much detail early could jeopardize the investigation. They chose to stay guarded, issuing statements that the case remained active and that residents were not in immediate danger. From a forensic point of view, Milton's victim profile created a paradox. He was a low-risk target, yet the attack was personal, methodical, and staged to look random. That contradiction helped investigators focus. The case file now showed three intersecting lines: the victim's routine stability, the spouse's contradictory testimony, and the third-party connection through digital and financial data. The escalation stage of this investigation did not involve the victim seeking trouble. It was the hidden dynamics around him escalating to a lethal outcome. Law enforcement understood that in many cases of intimate partner homicide, escalation is not visible until after the fact. This case fit that pattern. Milton's death, when viewed through victimology, highlighted a reality often uncomfortable for communities. The greatest danger is not always from strangers in the dark, but from people within one's own circle. That findings shaped the next stage of the investigation, when detectives prepared to directly confront the individuals connected to him most closely. By the time the first week of the investigation closed, detectives had moved from merely collecting anomalies to assembling a prosecutable theory. The crime scene had been processed, the autopsy confirmed strangulation, and the victimology showed Milton Sawyer was low risk for random attack. Now, the task was to determine who had both access and motive and how to turn suspicion into admissible evidence. Investigators began by revisiting the inconsistencies in statements. The initial claim of a home invasion did not align with the lack of forced entry, no missing valuables, and the absence of defensive wounds typical of an attack by multiple intruders. Angel Sawyer's account of events contained discrepancies. She shifted details about how she heard noises, the order in which she claimed things happened, and the timeline of her 911 call. Each variation, documented carefully, weakened her credibility. To build a charging theory, detectives relied on three categories: testimonial contradictions, forensic consistency, and digital corroboration. Each needed to reinforce the other so that the case could withstand judicial scrutiny. A crime staged as a burglary requires proof of staging, and proof of staging requires evidence that contradicts normal behavior. Phone records became central. Analysts documented frequent contact between Angel Sawyer and Isaac Melcher, the massage therapist. While some calls were innocuous, others occurred during late hours, and their frequency increased in the months leading up to Milton's death. Text messages, retrieved through subpoenas, showed a closeness inconsistent with professional boundaries. These records, combined with eyewitness accounts of seeing Melcher near the Sawyer home, gave investigators both motive and opportunity. Financial patterns added another layer. While Milton managed the antique shop steadily, there were smaller accounts in his wife's name. Transfers linked to Isaac Melcher raised red flags. Bank documents showed irregular withdrawals, some timed close to meetings between Angel and Isaac. The pattern suggested not only personal involvement, but shared planning. The charging theory required that detectives anticipate defense arguments. One common defense in domestic homicides is to suggest unknown third parties or burglars. By establishing that no valuables were missing and that entry points were undisturbed, police cut off that narrative. Another potential defense would be to argue that Melcher acted alone. Yet the phone records, texts, and financial links suggested coordination. Prosecutors would need to show conspiracy, not just opportunity. Detectives also reviewed Angel's demeanor. While demeanor alone is not evidence, it becomes relevant when coupled with contradictions. Officers noted that she did not ask routine questions typical of grieving spouses, such as, "What hospital is he in?" or "Can I see him?" Instead, she repeated the burglary story, focusing on narrative rather than concern. These observations, entered into reports, built context for prosecutors. A turning point came when Melcher was interviewed under pressure. Faced with mounting digital evidence and inconsistencies in his own story, he admitted to physical involvement. This confession, once documented and verified, was not just a statement, it was leverage. It placed Angel at the center of conspiracy and clarified that the crime was not random but coordinated. For prosecutors, charging theory means drawing a line between suspicion and proof. They had autopsy confirmation of strangulation, corroborated by Melcher's statement. They had a staged crime scene, confirmed by the absence of forced entry or theft. They had motive, an affair, financial irregularities, and personal benefit from Milton's death. And they had conspiracy, shown by coordinated communications and corroborating admissions. In Elizabeth City, this shift from mystery burglary to domestic conspiracy carried weight. Residents already unsettled by the crime now saw a narrative forming. Not outsiders invading homes at random, but betrayal within a marriage leading to lethal violence. Prosecutors worked carefully with detectives to frame indictments. Melcher's cooperation gave leverage, but also risk. Deals had to be considered. In exchange for testimony against Angel, Melcher might face reduced charges. Such negotiations are procedural realities in homicide cases, where proving conspiracy often depends on the words of one conspirator. By the end of this phase, the charging theory was complete. Angel Sawyer was positioned as the central planner, Isaac Melcher as the physical actor, and Milton Sawyer as the victim of a staged burglary turned homicide. The evidence matrix was strong. Testimonial contradictions, digital proof, financial links, forensic consistency, and partial confession. The stage was now set for indictments to be filed and for the case to move from investigation to courtroom. For the community, this revelation changed the conversation. What began as whispers about crime in their quiet town now became a clear story of betrayal and conspiracy. And for law enforcement, the case demonstrated how careful sequencing of victimology, digital records, and forensic anomalies builds a theory that can withstand trial. The courtroom in Pasquotank County had seen its share of felony cases, but the trial of Angel Sawyer drew an unusually heavy crowd. From the first day of jury selection, residents of Elizabeth City filled the benches, watching as a story that had begun with a midnight emergency call turned into one of the county's most unsettling prosecutions. Reporters lined the hallway, waiting for a glimpse of the woman once introduced in public as a grieving wife but now described by the state as a co-conspirator to murder. The state opened its case with a reminder of the early hours of August 2, 2018. Deputies had rushed to the Sawyer residence expecting a burglary in progress. Instead, they found a quiet home, valuables untouched, and Milton Sawyer lying lifeless in his bedroom. Prosecutors made it clear to the jury the absence of broken windows, the locked front door, and the untouched cash jar in plain sight were not oversights by investigators. They were signs that the intruder Angel described never existed. Jurors were walked through the chain of events investigators had pieced together. Records from the 911 dispatch were synchronized with cell tower logs. Phone data placed Angel and Isaac Melcher in contact at times that conflicted with her initial statement. Analysts explained how the patterns in those calls were inconsistent with panic and loss, but consistent with coordination before and after Milton's death. A detective told the court, "It wasn't what we found that told the story. It was what should have been there and wasn't." That negative space, the missing signs of forced entry, the missing evidence of robbery, became as important as the physical items entered into evidence. Jurors were then shown photographs of the Sawyer home. They were sterile, clinical images. The front door intact, drawers undisturbed, the bed where Milton was discovered still neat on one side. These pictures carried weight not because they shocked, but because they failed to show chaos. Prosecutors emphasized that in authentic burglaries, the signs of disorder are unavoidable. Here, everything was too quiet, too neat. The jurors nodded, some taking notes. The most decisive evidence came from testimony. Isaac Melcher had already entered a plea to second-degree murder and, as part of that agreement, admitted under oath that he restrained Milton during the staged attack. His allocution, read aloud in court, confirmed that Angel had been present and aware. The defense attempted to minimize his credibility, pointing out that his plea reduced his prison exposure. But prosecutors reminded jurors that his admission aligned with the digital trail, the scene photographs, and the statements Angel herself had given in the hours after Milton's death. Cross-examination revealed the strategy of Angel's defense. Attorneys suggested that she had been manipulated by Melcher, that her grief and fear made her susceptible to pressure. They highlighted stress within the marriage, financial tension, and Milton's demanding business schedule. But the prosecution countered with a straightforward point. Angel had not presented herself as a victim of manipulation in the days after the crime. She had constructed the story of an armed intruder and repeated it consistently until the digital and testimonial evidence began to close in. Court observers noted that the jury appeared attentive throughout. They leaned forward during the testimony of a forensic phone analyst who charted out the pattern of calls and texts. The analyst explained how the data points overlapped with camera footage from intersections near Melcher's clinic and the Sawyer residence. It created a geographic loop, Elizabeth City locations only minutes apart, that showed opportunity and coordination. For the prosecution, this closed the circle. The sentencing phase carried its own tension. Victim impact statements were read aloud, with family and friends describing Milton Sawyer not as a case file but as a father, a friend, and a small business owner whose antiques shop had been a fixture in town. Their words reminded the jury and the court that the trial was not only about legal elements but about the loss of a person woven into the community's daily life. When the verdict was announced, the courtroom was silent. The jury found Angel Sawyer guilty of first-degree murder. The judge imposed the mandatory sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Melcher, already convicted under his plea agreement, received a sentence of 20 to 25 years. The sentences reflected two different levels of responsibility but shared recognition that Milton's death had not been the result of chance. It was planned inside the home. For Elizabeth City, the verdicts provided closure but also discomfort. The community had followed the case from the first night deputies rushed into a quiet house. Many residents admitted afterward that they wanted to believe the original story, that a stranger had broken in and committed violence. Accepting that the crime was domestic in origin, orchestrated by someone Milton trusted most, forced people to rethink assumptions about safety and betrayal. In reflection, the prosecution's success rested less on dramatic exhibits than on consistency. Every piece of evidence, the phone records, the photographs, the testimony, pointed in the same direction. Jurors were not asked to make leaps of imagination. They were asked to follow the chain of facts, and the chain held. The Sawyer case underscored how modern homicide trials rely not only on physical evidence but on digital traces and the logic of what is absent. It also illustrated how plea agreements can function. One suspect accepts a lesser sentence in exchange for testimony, ensuring at least partial accountability while building a stronger case against the primary defendant. By the end of the proceedings, the town that once walked past Milton's antique shop on Main Street now carried a sobering reminder. Crimes can be staged to look like something else, but forensic detail and patient investigation can strip away the disguise. The sentencing of Angel Sawyer to life in prison without parole and of Isaac Melcher to 20 to 25 years closed the legal chapter of the case, but the consequences rippled outward long after the courtroom doors shut. Elizabeth City was left to confront the human and civic cost of a crime that had begun inside a family and spilled into public record. The trial established facts beyond doubt, but trials don't always answer the deeper questions communities carry. How could it happen here? How do we reconcile the public image of a couple with the private conspiracy that ended in homicide? The first sign of lasting impact appeared in the Sawyer family's antique shop. For years, Milton had been known as the man who could source, repair, and restore items with care. His store was not only a business but a social place where neighbors exchanged local news and visitors from outside the county stopped for a chat. After his death, the shop closed. Windows once decorated with carefully arranged antiques sat dark, a visible reminder that the crime was not confined to one night. It had dismantled a livelihood and erased a point of connection for the town. Investigators who testified in court also spoke later to journalists about the strained cases like this leave behind. One detective noted that domestic conspiracies present a unique difficulty. They lack the random motives of a burglary or the clear-cut resentment of a stranger attack. Instead, they require investigators to untangle layers of trust, deceit, and private dynamics that don't leave obvious fingerprints. The Elizabeth City case became a reference point in regional training for how to handle staged intrusions, emphasizing that the absence of disorder can be as telling as its presence. Community leaders organized a memorial walk a year after Milton's death. It was not just a tribute, but also a statement that residents refused to allow the town's identity to be reduced to the crime. Local clergy framed it as both a remembrance and a lesson, that trust, once broken in such an intimate way, demands accountability beyond legal sentencing. Residents spoke about the shock of realizing the threat had not come from outside, but from within the home itself. The memorial underscored that the boundary between personal betrayal and public consequence is thin. The Sawyer case also shaped conversations in North Carolina's legal community about plea deals in homicide cases. Melcher's agreement to plead to second-degree murder in exchange for testimony raised questions that went beyond this single trial. Some saw it as necessary. Without his admissions, the case against Angel would have been more difficult. Others viewed it as inadequate, noting that a man who admitted to restraining Milton during his final moments might be eligible for release within a few decades. The debate illustrated how justice is not always cleanly measured by years of sentencing, but by the confidence of the public in the process. For true crime followers, the Sawyer case reinforced an uncomfortable truth. Staged crimes can briefly deceive but rarely withstand systematic forensic review. From phone logs to the absence of forced entry, each anomaly pointed back toward the same conclusion. Law enforcement experts later used the case in lectures as an example of negative evidence, the things missing that should have been there. The principle is simple but powerful. When the pieces don't fit, investigators must ask not only what is visible, but what is conspicuously absent. For Milton's surviving family members, the aftermath was more personal. Court records show that victim impact statements carried strong emotions, anger, sadness, but also a determination that his life not be remembered solely for its violent end. His children and siblings emphasized his role in the community and the daily kindness he extended to neighbors. They asked that the lesson not be about sensational betrayal alone, but about vigilance in relationships and the importance of addressing dysfunction before it escalates to irreversible harm. Years later, public interest in the case has not fully faded. Media documentaries and true crime podcasts revisit the Sawyer homicide because it encapsulates a type of crime that unsettles audiences, domestic conspiracies masked as random violence. Unlike cases with ambiguous evidence, the Sawyer file is clear, yet the clarity does not soften the impact. If anything, it highlights how methodical deception can collapse under methodical investigation. For Elizabeth City, the lesson remains present. Murders aren't just violations of law, they are breaches of trust that alter how neighbors view one another. As one local pastor said during a memorial, "We lock our doors against strangers. We forget the real danger can sometimes sit across our own tables." That remark, recorded in local coverage, struck a chord with residents because it captured the core discomfort left behind. The Sawyer case reached its legal end in 2019 with sentencing. Angel remains in custody under life without parole. Melcher serves his 20 to 25-year term in state prison. There are no appeals pending that change the substance of those outcomes. The case file is closed in the courts, but it continues to serve as both a cautionary story and an instructional case in investigative procedure. For viewers of true crime, cases like Milton Sawyer's carry dual weight. They are both narratives of betrayal and lessons in forensic logic. They show how ordinary records, dispatch logs, phone data, absence of broken locks, can speak louder than dramatic scenes. They remind us that accountability in crime does not rest solely on catching lies, but on proving facts. In Elizabeth City, North Carolina, the courtroom revealed the truth of a crime first staged as a burglary. Prosecutors laid out the case against Angel Sawyer and Isaac Melcher. No forced entry, valuables left untouched, and digital records tying the two together in months of planning. Forensic testimony confirmed Milton Sawyer died by strangulation, not by the hands of an intruder, but through a calculated act within his own home. Jurors rejected Angel's shifting stories. She was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy, sentenced to life without parole. Melcher accepted a plea for second-degree murder, receiving 20 to 25 years in prison. The sentences reflected both his cooperation and his role as the direct assailant. Family and friends of Milton spoke of a man devoted to his antique shop and community. Their loss could not be repaired, but accountability brought closure. The antique store that once held history now stood as a reminder of betrayal exposed. The case ended with clarity. Justice confirmed the crime was not a random act, but one built on trust broken from within. Angel Sawyer, life without parole. Isaac Melcher, 25 years. Milton Sawyer, remembered for his life, not only his death. Looking back on this case, I'm reminded that betrayal often begins in silence and grows in shadows we choose to ignore. Trust is powerful, but it can also be dangerous when placed in the wrong hands. Milton Sawyer's story teaches us to stay alert, value honesty, and never underestimate the signs that something isn't right. In communities across America, we can learn from this tragedy. Protect your loved ones, speak up when you sense danger, and never let fear keep you quiet. What do you think this case reveals about trust and accountability in families? I'd love to hear your perspective. Drop a comment with your thoughts or simply let me know where you're watching from. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next true crime case we uncover together.